All right, I think we can get started. Let's jump into the first slide, please. I'm going to be our host for today's conversation. My name is Sierra Noakes. I'm the Director of EdTech Policy and Standards at Digital Promise, and before that, I was a special educator in New York. I am thrilled to be joined by this amazing panel. Um, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll go through the order. So we'll start with Mario.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm Mario Andrade. I'm the superintendent of schools in Nashua, New Hampshire. A little bit on my background and my journey with AI. I was fortunate enough to be part of the work with Digital Promise around ethically designed AI product certification. And quite honestly, it was enlightening for me as a superintendent to be able to ask what are the right questions. 2 years ago when AI was coming out, there was a lot of unknowns. And as a superintendent, I was struggling with what's the right pathway? What questions do I ask? And really, through this work with Digital Promise and the certification process, it really focused me on what are the right questions? What do I need to do? And how do I really make some informed decisions around the AI I was going to be using in my classroom? Kind of fast forward a couple of years down the road, Nashua's at a point right now where we're partnering with AI companies on co-designing research in our schools. So going from a place of really what's the right questions to now be able to work with um, our partners around AI on what are we trying to solve, what's the action research we're going to do, what does R&D look like in our schools, has really been my journey for the last couple of years around AI and really talking about what are our technical challenges, what's the right tool to our adaptive challenges, and really what's working in the classrooms, what's the questions that we're asking, and then how do we lead to change. I'm fortunate enough to be here with really exceptional panelists, so I'm looking forward to a great conversation over the next hour.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mario. Natalia?
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Sierra, and hi, everyone. I'm Natalia Kucirkova. I am director of the International Center for EdTech Impact, based in Norway, but operating in 32 countries. And I am a professor in early childhood development. And I think, Sierra, you asked us to say a few words about how we approach AI in our work. So at the center, we have a little AI lab. Where we have developed some tools that harness the latest Gen AI capabilities. One of them is an AI analyzer that is essentially a tool that systematically analyzes research articles or scientific publications, and it evaluates the quality of evidence in EdTech tools based on the criteria that we have trained it on. And we have been piloting the AI analyzer with some impact investors and EdTech companies and are constantly looking for good feedback. So if anyone is interested, please contact me. And in my personal capacity as professor, I'm interested in AI enhancements in children's digital literacy or digital reading tools. So I've been looking at some story making apps and LLMs for supporting children's phonological awareness or letter recognizing, as well as reading comprehension, different literacy outcomes. So I've been trying to understand what are the potentials and what are the drawbacks of the latest AI developments in this space. Excited to be here and hearing from other panelists as well. Shall I pass on to the next one?
Hi, my name is Ran Liu. I'm the chief AI scientist at Amira Learning, which is an intelligent reading tutor and assessment. Um, I spent the first decade of my career as a researcher working at the intersection of learning science and AI in education. One of the things I worked on during that time was a research project called Project Listen, which is the project that Amira's technology is originally rooted in. Both my own career and the core technology behind Amira as an intelligent tutor has really, involved AI for learning for decades. And even when it, became Amira as a product that served classrooms, AI was a core part of the technology. At that time, the capabilities that we focused on building were accurate interpretation of children's speech as they read out loud, and accurate measurement of reading skill mastery, and on like near real-time intelligent selection of micro interventions to help kids build their reading skills. And as large language model technology became mainstream, we have, of course, expanded our AI capabilities accordingly to enable features like dialogue, for example. But we've been, I personally in my career, and then we at Amira have been thinking about AI for a really long time, and how it can be leveraged to drive actual impact. And we don't see it as just like a cool feature, right? It's has to be used in service of learning. So great to be here. I'm going to pass it on to Julia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Wilkowski, and I lead Google's pedagogy and learning sciences team. So what that means is that we're trying to bridge the gap between education research and product development in both directions. So that means, how do we work with product developers to incorporate learning science and teaching best practices? And then how do we evaluate the impact that we're having on learners and educators with the products that we're building? So we work across lots of different Google products: Gemini, Classroom, YouTube, Search, as well as the teams that are building underlying models like LearnLM. And I also was a former 6th grade math and science teacher, so trying to bring the best of that magical year, those magical years, into our products as well. Back to you, Sierra.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm really glad we got all of these brilliant folks together today. To kick off our conversation, I'll do a really brief overview on the framework that inspired this conversation, and then we'll dive into panel questions on core topics such as apply research, use meaningful measures, and leverage relevant expertise. In the final about 15 minutes of this time will be Q&A. So please feel free to drop. I got notifications from folks that our chat is disabled during this, so I'm so sorry about asking for folks to do something they couldn't. But you can do Q&A. If you hold your cursor over the screen, you'll see participants, chat, react, and then a more. If you click more, there's a Q&A box that will let you drop questions throughout. Please feel free to share during the conversation so that we can have a rich Q&A at the end. Awesome. So we engaged in a project to understand what AI's role should be in teaching and learning. By collaborating with our working group of experts, engaging in almost 60 interviews with education leaders, developers, and subject matter experts, and conducting a literature review, we formalized a framework grounded in 3 principles: evidence-based, learner-centered, and skill building. Within each principle, we dug into actionable practices and offered research-based strategies to support the development and implementation of emerging technology and AI-enabled tools best positioned to support powerful learning. If we could jump to the next slide. This is the first webinar of a series that offers a deep dive into each principle, with today's focus on the evidence-based principle. Within this principle, we highlight 3 key practices: apply research, use meaningful measures, and leverage relevant expertise. Apply research speaks to the need for emerging technologies to extend and deepen our current understanding of learning theories. Use meaningful measures addresses the importance of defining the intended impact and evaluating outcomes to understand whether the tool is doing what it's supposed to do. And then leverage relevant expertise considers how developers should collaborate with education leaders, educators, and subject matter experts to design tools best positioned to support powerful learning. In today's conversation, we will ask panelists to respond to questions that address each of these practices. And with that, I think we can stop sharing the screen and see faces a little better. And I'll kick it off with the first question to our panelists. Feel free to popcorn. Hop around, jump in when you're ready. Our first question, and I'll share it in the chat after I read it out. What are some approaches developers, researchers, and education leaders can leverage to keep up with new research to drive product design, testing, evaluation, and procurement?
Mario, you want to go?
I came off, Rand, it looked like you were about to go, but I'll speak kind of broadly from a superintendent's point of view and then kind of come back. And I think it's really from a superintendent's lens, and be careful on how I say this, it's really a change of mindset, right? So when I look at how do we keep up with it, or like educational leaders, R&D must be an expectation of leaders, school boards, and systems, not to be an option or a choice. R&D needs to be a fundamental way embedded into our daily practice, right? So oftentimes we say we want to try to do something, and it's a silo, it's a set aside, or it's a partnering on a big kind of project. Well, first and foremost, I think we need to kind of move from R&D as an exception to R&D as a rule, and I think that sets the mindset, and then it leads into like, you know, perfect can't be, good can't be the enemy of perfect, or whatever that quote is there, right? But I think all too often as educators, we're afraid to try something because it might go wrong. And I think that we need to have that mindset on we need to be doing R&D, little R&D in our schools to build our capacity. So how do you stay, how do you partner with either companies or try some research? But I think it's that mindset of like, I need to try this because there's a problem we need to address in the schools. And I'll probably circle back later.
Awesome. So, speaking from the perspective of a product developer, I think one really important place to start is just to read the latest and most relevant scientific papers and also reach out to the experts, like the authors of those papers, and try to talk to them. This might seem like a stretch if like your background is in research, but I think you would be surprised by how friendly and willing most researchers and scientists are to engage with a product if there's the chance that it would be a vehicle through which they could scale their research to actually impact the classroom. So just to give a really concrete example, a couple of years ago, when we wanted to leverage the emerging LLM technology to expand Amira's capabilities in tutoring for reading comprehension, because we saw some opportunities there where we could incorporate, LLM powered dialogue. We wanted to see, well, what is the research, on helping kids develop reading comprehension tell us about how we should structure those kinds of experiences and how we should try to structure those dialogues and what we need to think about in the pedagogy. So of course, one of the key papers we came across was first authored by Nell Duke, who's like a premier researcher in that area. So we reached out to Nell, we engaged her on the topic. She was responsive, she was really interested in engaging on it. And we ended up working very closely with her on developing out that feature. And she remains a very close advisor to this day. Now, not every, researcher or situation may end up with that level of involvement. But in my experience, most researchers are very happy to have at least a conversation or a couple conversations where they can help to connect you with other papers and other experts that can really inform the pedagogy of the product.
And I would build on to what Rand was saying about, I think there's two elements to this at Google. One is sharing insights from existing research, and then also keeping on track of new emerging literature as well. So what we did at Google was we tried to distill a century of learning science research into 5 core principles that we've built into our design, development, and evaluation strategy and our rubrics. So those are things that are very basic and, again, most likely to lead to learning outcomes. Things like inspiring active learning, managing cognitive load, inspiring curiosity and motivation, deepening metacognition, and adapting to the learner. And so then the other part of what we do is we conduct our own research, talking with educators, learners, district leaders about what's important for them in our products, hearing examples of how they're using Gen AI tools to enhance their teaching and learning practices, and then doing short and longer term studies as well. So that's all kind of the existing research. And then the latest research, sometimes we'll have book clubs, speakers, article sharing, and we also have notebook LMs set up that are shared across our product development teams where we can add latest research articles that we're seeing. And then anyone in the company who's developing a learning related product can go in and see what the latest research says about any given topic or the feature that they're developing.
This is all music to my ears because as a researcher, I really like to be contacted by various EdTech organizations. And I know that I'm not the only one. Indeed, I do believe, as the previous panelist said, that it is the case that as scientists, we do not want our papers to sit on the library shelves, but actually be used and actively engaged with. So maybe for those of you who don't have the infrastructure within your organizations, or perhaps don't feel fully confident to reach out to researchers, I would say that do engage with the existing networks that exist. There is, for example, the UNESCO Global Alliance on the Science of Learning. That is a global alliance, as it says in its name, that has annual meetings in December in Paris, where we do bring together researchers together with digital technology producers and providers. At our center, we create a network of learning scientists. At the moment, we have 1,200 different researchers who are keen to be contacted, and they do provide a lot of pro bono advice and recommendations, and are delighted when we can match them with specific EdTech organizations that need some support in their specific subject matter. So there is a lot happening, and really the old saying that, science is on one side and then the innovation is on the other side, that is no longer happening. We have seen that really it's the question of how many researchers do you have on your advisory board or you engage with. So please be part of this trend and help us ensure that all tools are built with the latest and best science in mind.
Sierra, if I can just kind of add to that from a practitioner, right? So there's a lot of I'm not a researcher, the limited time as a superintendent. I also do use, AI to give me the research, right? So I have emails that come in as here's the research coming out and summarizes things. So I think you have to, as a superintendent or a leader, on how do you get information to flow into you, and then what's your informal and formal networks that you can actually learn what's happening. Because sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, unless you're at a conference, unless you bump into somebody. So, but I use, every morning I get a bunch of emails saying, here's a bunch of research that's coming out, and, a quick little summary of hot topics. So I think, again, it's hard as educational leaders to stay on top of everything and read a lot of research papers. So again, use your informal and formal networks that are showcasing the latest and the greatest. So but it is really difficult to be like, oh my goodness, I never heard of that, or we just get stuck in our ways. So the more you can network to get that research, and especially if they can summarize it for you, the better.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for sharing. That's so insightful. And I think often it's so intimidating to read a research paper and not know who's on the other side of it. But it is a person. And often, to Natalia's point, it's a person like Natalia or myself who's begging product developers or school district leaders to engage with the work. So I think most likely you would make someone's day, if not week, by reaching out. And then I think another piece of that too is often when we publish research, it's for a broad audience, and that can kind of make it difficult to translate to your specific context and needs. And so those conversations can help translate the research findings to practical, actionable steps that you can take, whether you're in a district or a school or a classroom or a product company, that I think is really helpful and invaluable. Before we jump into the next question, just flagging again, please use the Q&A button if any of the responses inspired follow-up. We would love to dig in deeper as we jump into Q&A in just a little bit. With that, I will ask the second question. This is a big one, so if you want to share some, we can pop back around. We're doing really well on time. How do you know that a product is working and worth the investment? And if we want to unpack some of the layers here, how do we define what success looks like? And then how do we hold ourselves accountable to that success metric? And what if it goes awry from Mario's perspective?
So, I'll start it off again from a superintendent's kind of lens. Again, I think, Sierra, you mentioned what's the metrics when you're going into this partnership of, again, what was the problem that you were trying to solve, and did you actually come up with the metrics that you know you're successful, right? I'll speak candidly, and it's one of those things where we have companies on the panel as well, right? Is that anytime as a superintendent I sit down with a company, they're going to say that their product is the best, right? Like that's just always happens. So how do you kind of weave through that? And I think it's really through the co-design of knowing what's the problem that you're solving for. Do you have fidelity to the implementation of the plan? Um, and if it's worth the investment, right? What are those desired outcomes? And sometimes they might be short-term goals or short-term wins, and others are long-term, right? So, you think about the reading programs, and again, we might see, um, we're closing raising student achievement, reading scores are going up, but we also know in the long term that we're going to save money on other positions if all students are actually reading better. So I think there's some short-term and long-term wins. I think when you go in is, are you clear on what you're trying to solve? And then also being clear that you're asking a company to do something that wasn't promised, right? And then saying it didn't work. So I think again, it's that clear in the designing for the research and design at the beginning so that you can measure your success.
So I can talk a little bit about our approach at Google, how we handle this. And I think one interesting dichotomy is that we have products that are built directly for learners who are using them outside of school. Let's say they're stuck on their homework, they want to study for an exam, things like Search, Gemini, YouTube. And then we also have institutional products that we're designing and building for. So for that first bucket, the consumer products, we think a lot about transfer of learning, or other facets, like maybe for our exam prep features, we want students to be able to not only feel more confident with the exam that they're taking, but also achieve the score that they are looking for. For institutional products, there's a ton of metrics that we are looking at, and it really does vary by school district, but it could be, there's a lot of learning outcomes data, but also attendance data or graduation rates, that are a bit longer term that we are looking at as well. But to get more specific on our consumer-facing products, we have designed rubrics that are aligned with each one of the principles that I mentioned before, that outline what behaviors we would see in a chatbot interaction that would be evidence that active learning is happening, for example, or that we're managing cognitive load well. And then we have a series of lots of different kinds of evaluations that we do on very short time horizons to really long time horizons. So some of them we're building critic models where a model will evaluate the quality of the chatbot interaction itself. We have humans who are looking at the quality and, again, assessing everything on the rubrics that we have developed. And then we do randomized control trials, either short term or even long term. We're doing some that are up to a year long. So lots of different ways of evaluating. And we do, because product development needs to move forward more quickly than most RCTs will give us those insights, we do have a lot of proxies for learning and have educators assess the quality of our outputs prior to releasing them.
Yeah, Julia, you did a great job kind of covering a couple of like the different levels of measurement that I think are really important, but only feasible at kind of different time frames. I think, just to double click on everything that's been said before, the most important thing is you have to measure whether a product is working, and you have to make sure that what you're measuring is, aligned with your goals. I think at the kind of most short-term and simplest level, you can measure with the data that you collect within the product, right? You have to design for this, but a very concrete example is that when we develop new micro interventions that kids get when they have a certain reading skill struggle, we actually look at future opportunities they have then to demonstrate growth on that particular skill. And we look at whether the learning that we're expecting to drive is playing out in all of their future opportunities. So that's like a very micro level measurement that you can do, but there's lots of things like that within the product, right? When you implement a new feature, you just have to be thinking about, like, how are we going to measure if this feature is working and if it's driving the kind of learning that we designed it to drive. And then there's this other level where you really want to go a little bit longer term, where you may want to look at the impact on assessment outcomes before and after they've used your product. And you may want to look at things like the relationship between the dosage on the product and the growth. And this is something that we do a lot, both using our own assessment and using external assessments that districts want to provide to co-collect data with us and to look at the outcomes. I'm really encouraged by the fact that it seems like a lot of districts have increased their appetite for conducting this kind of research. It's not as formal as an RCT, right? It's not going to be as controlled as an RCT, but it's still worth looking at. It's still important to say, just within the school year, did we see the growth that we set out to drive with the adoption of this product and the usage of this product? So yeah, we're really lucky that lots of districts are interested in this. They're willing to work with us. They're willing to share data. Sometimes they do the research, sometimes we do the research, but it just has to be done. It's really important. And then the other thing we do is we look at cases where it's not working to the level, or like it's not having the effect size that we would expect, and we actually dig in and see what happened. Like, were there implementation challenges? Like, where were the issues, and that helps us to define our roadmap for further features and improvements to make. So I think just that, like, kind of experimental iterative mindset is really important, and the measurement mindset is really important. And then of course the holy grail, if you have the means, you should absolutely run RCTs with external research institutions. It's really important.
Yeah, I really second what was said as well, and perhaps just to not add anything new, but more like summarize what previous panelists shared. I think we have a short slide on this, Sierra, where we have these 5 buckets of evaluation, really, a bit like what Ran was saying, that you can be looking at efficacy as one of the way of understanding impact. The other way of understanding impact is looking at effectiveness, which is not necessarily a research study that would be led and conducted fully by scientific researchers, but more led by teachers and practitioners, and looking at the contextual of it, looking at the pedagogical value of the tool, and perhaps to what extent it can be replicated across different classrooms. Whereas in the efficacy, would be looking more at the randomized control trial as the sort of golden standard in research. And then I don't know if I am able to share. Is it me sharing? You are able to look at the ethics and equity. Oh yeah, perfect. Thank you. It's a nice memory cue for me as well. So in terms of ethics in this 5E framework, the question to us would be, how does the solution work? So what are the data practices? What is the evidence of impact in terms of processing of personal data, safety, privacy, questions around educational impact on the ethical, in the ethical domain. And of course, as we are designing for all learners and aiming for universal design and ensuring that any tool doesn't work only for the top 5% of the classroom, but really for everyone, it's important to be asking the equity question in all of our evaluations. So who does the solution work for? And the fifth E that I would love to see more represented in EdTech research is around environment. So not only what is happening within and around the tool immediately in the classroom, but how is this all affecting our planet? What is happening in terms of sustainability? So these are the different elements or domains of impact that are useful to include in any evaluation. And ideally, it will be a combination of all of the E's in running holistic EdTech evaluations. Partly to respond to all of the SDGs, as it's indicated there, the Sustainable Development Goals that UN agencies are promoting, and partly to ensure that we get an answer that is holistic, that is not only giving us a slice of reality, but is responding to all of the questions that teachers, parents, investors, providers, all members of the ecosystem might have. I think I just wanted to briefly mention one more thing, and that was that this 5 E's framework that was developed by scientists, I think it was the past 3 years, and I can put the links in the chat. It was adopted by an organization called Edu Evidence, which I think we have on the next slide. Megan, thank you. This is essentially an organization that rewards EdTech tools and EdTech products that have been independently verified and evaluated by various certification providers or evidence providers, including Digital Promise, that, as you may know, has a certification scheme and aligns with ESA standards that are so important to follow in evaluating EdTechs in the efficacy strand to understand whether they work and how they impact our learners. So it's a way of ensuring that when EdTech solutions have been through the journey of verification and evidence building, that they are in a place where they can be easily found and recognized, and that we as consumers of EdTechs, we all are, right, on our daily basis, that we perhaps see this as an aspirational system for the field, so that we encourage all EdTech providers to be following an evidence-based approach to how they are building their tools, how they are implementing them, and how they are ultimately scaling them. And as Ran said, it's never a linear journey. There will be always some detours, right? So that you might find out things that do not work. And it's really the strength of an EdTech organization to show how they addressed aspects that didn't work. So I encourage fellow providers, EdTech providers, to be thinking about their research from the start, and just something that's an ongoing journey. It's not a quick study that you can conduct and you have done your evidence. It's something that needs to be built into the DNA of the organization.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for sharing. I think what's also really interesting is I've historically heard district leaders reference RCTs, which are randomized controlled trials, as the gold standard. And so they see if there is an RCT, great, there must be evidence, let's move forward. And I think it's really important and came up deeply in the conversation. But your context probably looks different than where the RCT was conducted. Your teacher's engagement with tech might be different. There's so many variables at play. So even if there are multiple studies showing that this product will drive positive change, you should still build out a plan to test it for your community, and make sure it works for your kiddos and teachers and staff. Okay, I'm going to kick us over to the next question, which is a very nice flow from what we were just talking about. How can developers, education leaders, and researchers work together to drive product improvements for varied learner contexts? We spoke a little bit about how important those partnerships are, but I'd love to hear from our panelists kind of maybe examples or hypotheticals to dig into what does it look like? How do you broach the conversation with partners? And what, timeline should we be thinking about? What are some challenges to have at the front of these conversations and work through as partners?
I've been the one going last, so I can start this one, and I'll start perhaps by playing the devil's advocate, like what you should not do. And that is something that we have seen, we as researchers have seen as not working well. So perhaps we can build on the lessons learned, and that is it is not a good idea to send a tool that is just too early in its product development, or at least in the interactions we have had with EdTech providers and schools in various contexts and in various countries, indeed, is that across the globe, teachers are busy and their time is extremely valuable. So you don't want to take their valuable instruction time from testing a tool that is having many bugs, that is not ready for testing, basically. So make sure that you do some very basic user testing before you send it to schools to ensure that you respect and honor the teacher's time by presenting them something for their review and for their feedback and possible co-design. The other perhaps common sense recommendation, but again, we have seen cases where it was not necessarily followed, was that some providers might think that they developed a tool that teachers have never used before, and they'll think that this is the best tool ever. But actually, when they conduct a full or critical competitor analysis, they'll find that there exists at least 10 other tools that have a very similar idea to their idea. And this is quite common with AI tools. For some reason, we see on the market a lot of saturation, the sort of same idea, just in slightly different packaging. And many teachers feel a bit tired to be, receiving tools that have similar ideas and perhaps are not necessarily offering them something that will be very unique and specific to their needs. So doing a proper competitor analysis of what is out there on the market, what is the unique added value that my tool is bringing, and how is this responding to teachers' needs, that is the homework that you need to do before you go and solicit teachers' time. I would argue. Yeah. Don't know who wants to go next.
I think from a product perspective, the biggest thing is to collect feedback and be responsive to feedback, and that can take many different forms. So, with researcher feedback, the researchers that we work with, we often will ask them to audit the product, or go through and sort of tell us like, hey, here's an area where there's an opportunity to add features that would really bring to life something we're seeing in the research is really working, or this part is not really aligned with the current thinking in the science of reading anymore, we should change it, that kind of thing. So that's a really good way to get researchers to help drive product improvements. On the educator side, so much feedback. I think once you start being in schools, fortunately, most educators are very happy to provide feedback, and it can happen at many different levels. So, for example, we have the ability for teachers to rescore the scoring that the AI does. We use that in our directly in our development at multiple levels. We use it in conjunction with other expert labelers to generate high inter-rater reliability labels for our models, but we also use it to kind of qualitatively identify gaps in specific areas or maybe specific like, for example, kids with a certain kind of speech impediment, for example, we can like define that as a gap that we can target and work on specifically. So yeah, that's like one area, but of course, there's a lot of feedback that we're always getting relating to the kinds of features that are useful to teachers with respect to giving them data and empowering them with the right tools to do their jobs better. And yeah, so I just think thinking through the different levels of feedback that you can collect and really just making that a core part of your product iteration.
And I would echo a lot of what Ren said, which mirrors the approach that we take a lot as well, which is we collaborate with trusted testers, education leaders, researchers, and we think it's important not only to do our own pre-research, like Natalia mentioned, but also then have external organizations also evaluate the quality of our products so that we're not always just grading our own homework. And like you both said, we make sure that all that feedback is taken and leads to product improvements as well. So some of the interesting projects that we've done recently are partnering with major school districts like the Miami-Dade School District in the US and Northern Ireland, where we can really assess at that broad scale what's working, what are those pain points, where are the AI tools not working, and really identify not only student outcomes, but some of the other things like teacher efficiency or how are teachers applying some of these tools to be more creative and reach more of their students in their classrooms. We've also done some studies with tutoring companies. So we did a study with ED, which is a company in the United Kingdom that does math tutoring via chatbot. And we were able to supply them with AI-generated responses to students. All of these were monitored by their human tutors that were interacting with the students. And we found that over 80% of the time, those teachers actually, or the tutors selected the text that was generated by the AI model directly instead of needing any modification. So these are really interesting studies. And again, we have a huge range of them to really figure out what is working and what's not working in actual implementations with learners and with teachers. So excited to continue those collaborations. If anyone is interested, please reach out.
And so I think from a superintendent's level, I'll take it one step kind of higher before we even start engaging, is really to look at the strategies that are going to be involved, right? What's the the planning for the implementation? So what's your strategy, right? How is R&D planned and aligned with your district priorities? Are you even asking the right questions with the product, right? And so are you trying to solve a technical challenge, a curriculum challenge? Is an instructional issue, right? It could be an instructional issue and you're bringing in a product and nothing's changing. So I think we need to be really clear in our strategy. Also, from a superintendent's or educational leadership point of view, what's the structure? How is R&D organized and supported? Do you have the pieces in place to actually conduct this research to make sure the product is working? What's the intensity? How often are you collecting that data? What's your engagement? Like, are you just engaging with the company, teachers, students? Like, who are you engaging in to collect some feedback? And then I think, as we heard it from the other panelists, what's your evidence? How is the data going to be collected and used to inform the improvement? So I think the clearer we can get with that data is really going to be important. And I also think it's important for us, and we talk about ecosystems, is what is the environment for R&D to look like, right? How are school districts creating the necessary conditions for R&D to happen? Are we creating policies or governance or having the funding around for the R&D to happen? Are we building local capacity? Are we what actions are we taking to build the educators' capacities, their knowledge, their skills, and their talents? And then lastly, do we have the commitment to sustain what works? How do we identify what's working and double down on that? But also, as we heard, like, it's fine to fail, right? If something's not working, we don't have to keep on reinvesting in that. So how do we sustain what works and then again, use that measurement, refine, and then scale those innovations. So I think it's really a lot is designing in the implementation or the R&D, so that when a product is working or not working, you have again those steps and those matrix in order to provide some really detailed um, solutions. I also want to be really careful that a lot of times, when we're going into looking for new products, um, eh, are we intervening on interventions? Are we asking the right questions, right? So a lot of times we're looking for uh, the next saving grace, and we think it's a product when we really have to talk about, it might be, efficacy. What's our belief system? Are we creating the conditions for the students to be successful? So, are we just measuring from a data point of view on, skills, or are we really getting into how our districts and learning organizations to use these partnerships to make really systemic changes? So I think sometimes those are like two sides of the same coin. We need the urgency to make sure students are learning, but we also know we need to make some leadership moves that we create the conditions for R&D to happen, and we're also changing mindsets that we're really believing in all students.
Here you had a very good document that was produced with the Alliance, wasn't it, about R&D? I don't know if you can link it to the chat. I think it would be very good for the audience to sort of get more details on what all panelists have been sharing. Because it is a two-way street, isn't it? It's really thinking about what is it in it for us as producers, but also what is in it for the teachers and educators and the children. And I think that document is a very nice way of explaining the sort of ecosystem perspective on education R&D.
I'll dig around and look for it. This was such a great, rich conversation. And I think what comes through so clearly for me in this conversation and in the work I've done is that this is messy. It's not like a linear, you'll take a step and then the next step. Sometimes it feels like you're going backwards. And to Mario's point, call out when something's just not working. You don't have to double down and push in more. And sometimes if it's not working, you can collaborate with the provider to say, these dosage expectations are just unrealistic for our community. Is there a different approach we can take? But I think leaning into partnership is really a big core message coming through. We've got about 10 minutes left for audience questions, and we've had a few come through. Feel free to drop them in if there's anything on top of mind. But I'll start off with our first audience question. What do the panelists do to measure product fidelity, particularly in programs that are highly individualized? How do practitioners and product leaders work together to manage fidelity? I'll drop that in the chat too.
I can start us off with that question. We have a pretty well-defined way that we measure fidelity of the usage of our tutor product, and it is based in prior research we've done on like what level of dosage produces, the empirical outcomes that we're looking for. And so we're really, measuring just whether kids attain that level of fidelity, which is defined by a certain amount of usage, a certain number of times a week. And it's pretty simple to measure. And we do that for all of our districts, and it's part of their reporting. So yeah, it's just, I think, thinking about how you want to define, right, the fidelity of use, and ideally that's based in, I think, something empirical that tells you what's going to work. And then just to address the part about how we can work together to manage fidelity, this is a big one. I think, particularly with high tech products, there can be implementation challenges in the classroom. So, we have ways, I mean, a lot of times when things aren't working, like we hear about it, right? So that's an easy way that we can get involved. We have, tons of success managers out in the field kind of working with districts directly to manage usage to fidelity and to help alleviate blockers and challenges. But we also look, just in case people are not reaching out, we also look at the data of like, okay, are we seeing evidence that certain classrooms or certain schools are showing that kids are getting on and then they just kind of drop off and never use again, right? And we identify those cases and we'll actually proactively reach out and try to work with them to figure out what might be going on, what some of the challenges might be. And then like motivating kids is a whole other can of worms, but there's lots of interesting things that classrooms have done to make kind of using something to fidelity fun for kids, like competitions and sticker charts and things like that. So,
yeah. And that just kind of add to that. I think fidelity, it's how many products are we using or curriculums, right? And I think as we did a mapping just recently on at the elementary level, if we use all of our curriculums, products, partners, with everything to fidelity, I think the kids would be in school about 90 hours a week, right? It's not realistic. Everybody says if you use a fidelity, but kids are only in school for so long. So I think this is really what's our district's priorities. What tools are you using? How do you schedule it? And then how do you engage students? And I think really the so you have to map that. You just can't say yes to everything. And then, how do you leverage the best tools at the right time? And really, I think part of it is, to Rand's point, is that you want to engage kids, right? When the kids have hope, right, and they own the learning, they're going to engage more. So how do you turn it from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic, right? That they own their own learning, like using goals, right? Like I know Mario's going to be successful if I can do X, Y, and Z by the end of the week, right? And being that detailed, like this is the reason why you're using X, right? And then how do you measure that? So I think that's really important. But the fidelity question is like you need to have fidelity to whatever that product is to get the intended results. And I also think as leaders, we have to map out everything that we're using in a classroom to see if that's even possible. Because oftentimes we're not seeing the intended results because we can't schedule it. And that's not a fault of the product, right? Like that's just like, that's a fault of scheduling. I think that's a real hard conversation to have at the school or district level.
I agree so much. And I do think there's a piece of this where if the product team is developing in a silo without the educator voice, they might say something like 30 continuous non-interrupted minutes. But if you talk to any teacher, they would say that's ludicrous. There's no world in which kids aren't going to go to the bathroom or, zoom out for a minute. And so I think it's this really delicate dance of capacity, those precious instructional minutes getting maximized, and then also helping product teams understand how to design for the realities of the classroom. And the forever someone brings in, the uncharged tablet or laptop, and there's classroom environments are chaos. So designing for them is tricky and requires partnership. Awesome. Um, Natalia, do you want to respond to this one?
Very quickly, because I think this helps explain what we discussed before about these RCTs and combining them with teacher insights and, pedagogical evaluations. Because if you want a high quality RCT, you do need to follow certain dosage and intensity and standardized outcome measurements. And that is not always something that teachers can do. And this is just additional context to explain why fidelity needs to be not only measured, but also piloted and tested and developed in conversation with teachers and educators in various and diverse classrooms. So that it doesn't become this sort of blame game like, oh, the tool didn't work. Oh, but you didn't use it correctly. The design of the studies needs to be reflecting the design of the classrooms, to put it very simply. And that is why we need these partnerships.
Could not agree more, Natalia. Okay, I'm going to ask probably our last question from the audience. Scientific papers are often very dense to read and less understandable to those without deep expertise in the topic or hidden behind paywalls. What are you or others in the field doing to make research more accessible to superintendents who might not have time and the background to dig into these papers? Or Mario, any tips for soup hacks you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, just really, I mean, time is precious for a superintendent. So I do get like quick summaries and then I'll click into it, I'll save it in a folder and read it on the weekend. Um, but really, it is through organizations such as Digital Promise who might put out like webinars such as this that you can have an hour, whether it's real time or later on, but really those informal and formal networks that's leading you right down, down a road of what to look at, and then you can kind of go back. Again, conferences or webinars, but always keep your ear out of what's going there. There's a lot of information, but how do you just kind of glean through what's the most relevant?
I know I mentioned this in the chat, or actually, several of us mentioned this in the chat, and Julia actually mentioned it earlier. But LLMs can be really helpful when it comes to just kind of unpacking some of the complexity in those papers. You have to be a little bit careful because they can hallucinate. But we've had really good success with Notebook LM, which I know Julia mentioned earlier. We found it very reliable if you give it a paper or a set of papers in kind of helping to unpack that content without hallucinating.
I think individual universities have various research centers that provide newsletters and evidence briefs, not only from their own researchers, but also from other researchers that their researchers have engaged with. And this could be the traditional big universities like Harvard, Stanford, MIT in US, but it could be also other universities that perhaps if someone is eager to get the hot of the press research, then maybe that's another way of engaging with it. And as panelists mentioned, there are various conferences dedicated to technology and education have been running for decades. CHI conference, IDC conference, AERA. If someone has the possibility and the budget to attend, then it's a nice opportunity to meet with researchers and hear about the latest research as well.
Definitely. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much to the panelists. Andrew is going to share in the chat right now a bunch of resources where we've really tried to tackle this very request we did. So I think there was like over 200 articles that we read as part of the lit review for this Powerful Learning with Emerging Technology framework effort. We tried to summarize them. The paper is still admittedly pretty long, so the executive summary is where we're really trying to tackle that. We know you don't have that much time. Here's the high level takeaways. We hope those will be helpful to everyone out there. Thank you so much to this amazing panel. It was really wonderful to hear all of your expertise and strategies. We really appreciate your time and sharing all of your wonderful insights with everyone here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone. Bye.
Bye.